I think it was Voltaire who said if God didn't exist, one would have to invent him. And speaking of existence, today we have a show I've been looking forward to for a long time about one of the major proponents of existentialism, Simone de Beauvoir. Lover or hater, if Beauvoir didn't exist, she would have to be invented. Indeed, if she were here now, I'm sure she would remind us that human existence is always invented, in both senses of the word. Inventio in Latin means to find or discover. According to existentialist doctrine, we find ourselves thrown into a world that is not of our own making, but which we have no choice but to assume responsibility for. To exist means to invent by exercising our freedom to act. People who shirk that freedom are merely bad inventors. Those of you well acquainted with this program know that I am an avowed existentialist. May not be a card-carrying Sartrean or Beauvoirian, but I do believe that when all is said and done, we have the world we deserve, and that ultimately we are the authors of our destinies. We do not choose our facticity, yet we choose what to make of it. In my version of existentialism, we are responsible for far more than what we assume responsibility for. In short, I believe there is a considerable quotient of bad faith and self-deception in all of us, as individuals as well as a collective. That's one reason I think Simone de Beauvoir is one of the most important European intellectuals of the post-war period, because she never stopped reminding us of our existential freedom and agency. I have a feeling that my guest today agrees with me about Beauvoir, at least in part. We've been talking about doing this show for quite some time, and I'm delighted to welcome my colleague Jeremy Sable to the program. He is an intellectual historian and specialist of French literature, especially French existentialism. Jeremy received his PhD at Yale and is taught as a lecturer in Stanford University's program in Structured Liberal Education, otherwise known as SLE. Since 2003, he also lectures in Stanford's Master of Liberal Arts program. Jeremy, welcome to Entitled Opinions.
Thanks, Robert. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad finally. We've been talking about this for a few years, actually. So from our past conversations, I gather you agree with me that Simone de Beauvoir is not only a major intellectual, but that her thought is as relevant today as it was when she published groundbreaking books like The Second Sex and The Ethics of Ambiguities in the 40s and 50s. Am I right about that?
I think so, Robert. I'm a real big fan of Beauvoir. And if I have to think about her importance, first I would just say, you know, the importance of the existentialist in general to our contemporary moment, I think is really worth saying something about. Just the emphasis that we have in our own culture today, thinking about freedom and agency, and also worrying about victimhood, about social forces, and what do we do about the pressure of social forces? How much freedom do we in fact have with what seems like oppressive social forces all around us? This is just central questions for the existentialists. So I think all of them, the existentialists in general, are really important to us now, should be important to us now. But Beauvoir in particular, I think Beauvoir thought first and most clearly about how to think about individual freedom, given the fact that we're not all socially or politically free. And so I think Beauvoir is especially relevant today for us as we think about those problems.
So you would, I suppose, say that Jean-Paul Sartre is equally relevant, or is Simone de Beauvoir even more relevant in your view?
Yeah, good. And there's, you know, this is kind of one of the things that Sartreans and Beauvoirians fight about, or, you know, only maybe recently have we thought about it. It used to be that one was just a Sartrean, and Beauvoir herself was a Sartrean. I think Beauvoir offers some things earlier in her career that Sartre is struggling to articulate. So on that front, I think that she is the person to look to for some really good formulations of how to think about these problems. But of course, both of them were centrally worried about them, and I like to consider them as they consider themselves to be a team. So I think of their thought really, particularly the early work of the late 30s and the early 40s, where they really came to their first formulations of existentialism. They were working that stuff out together.
So are you saying that something like Being and Nothingness that Sartre publishes in 43 or 44.
43, yeah.
They were a team already when he was working on that book, and she helps him out?
Yes, totally.
Really?
Yeah, and we have good scholarship on this. I think the scholarship tends to, and for understandable reasons, want to put Beauvoir in the saddle for a lot of the great ideas of Being and Nothingness, partly because in her own career, both Sartre and Beauvoir in their lifetimes really gave him all the credit for it. So there's this kind of a little bit of a comeuppance there. And a little confusion on Beauvoirian's part to know why it is that she kind of undersold her own contributions. But we know for a fact now that Beauvoir was working on her first novel, L'Invité, or She Came to Stay, as it's translated into English. That got published in 1943 as well. And Beauvoir, in working through that novel, was reading through Hegel, reading through a bunch of things. And in the kind of period right before publication, they were working side by side, but before that they were separated and writing letters, and Beauvoir's reading Hegel and saying, Sartre, you got to read this stuff, it's amazing. Finding really great formulations from Hegel about, every self wants the death of the other, these kind of oppositional figures that we see so beautifully conveyed in Being and Nothingness are these kind of Hegelian formulations that Beauvoir is really finding first and articulating their importance to Sartre. The opening pages of Beauvoir's novel L'Invité is in some ways her own formulation of existentialism and our encounter with the other. And it's really just a beautifully concise...
Can you remind me of that opening?
Well, so the main character is in a theater, right? She works in a theater, and she's like on the empty stage. Actually, I don't remember if she's she's like leaving the theater or coming to the theater. And she's talking in the theater, right? A theater is just a wonderful place to talk about being thrown into the world, right? Everything is kind of a prop, and we adopt roles, and
right.
And of course, plays themselves are inventions, right? So the meaning of them is pure invention. And so the problem that this narrator encounters just in the few first pages is the kind of the problem of that all human meaning is created, that nothing is out there for us already, that we are thrown into a world without meaning, and that the reef of solipsism problem that Sartre encounters in Being and Nothingness is also really early on in the novel. She's like, well, is it just me out there? Or is there anybody else? So a lot of the great moves that are maybe more famous in Being and Nothingness, Beauvoir's working out at the same time, maybe a little bit before. They're sharing back ideas back and forth throughout this period in a really exciting way. It's just thrilling to read the letters.
Of course, that idea of that we're thrown into a world has a Heideggerian origin. Sartre, having gone to study with Heidegger, or
Yep.
at least was at the same university,
Yeah.
attending lectures, and this thrownness, big concept in Being and Time,
Yes.
1926,
Yep.
thrownness and facticity, transcendence. There's a Heideggerian matrix to many of the existentialist concepts there, although it's true, as you mentioned, that the Hegelian notion that the subject wants the death of the other because there's this conflict, this irresolvable conflict between two subjects, each of which is struggling to objectify the other. And I think some of the most potent passages or parts of the doctrine of Being and Nothingness have to do with these hell is other people, l'enfer c'est les autres.
Yep.
And that does have a Hegelian, not a particularly Heideggerian sort of origin. So, and I will talk, I think, shortly about how Jean-Paul Sartre and perhaps even Beauvoir's commitment to the Hegelian notion of conflict, intersubjective conflict, creates this dilemma for them when it comes to trying to articulate why a fully free existentialist subject must choose the freedom of the other. And it's almost like choosing the good of the other, where human relations are more a question of solidarity than they are of conflict. I think that's a fault line that runs through the whole theory.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Robert, I just got to make a pitch for Beauvoir's letters here. In 40 and 41, she's reading Hegel, and she's reading Hegel like we would read like Harry Potter. She reads the phenomenology in about 10 days, and then she immediately starts in on the logic. which is, not an easy book to plow through.
I never made it through.
Yeah, it's an impossible book. And she's writing letters to Sartre, like twice a day about how thrilling it is. It's like it's like a James Bond novel to her. It's just, and you really feel the excitement of that dialectic and this kind of what we would think of as a kind of a bleak confrontation of two subjects. For her, this is just thrilling. It's very powerful stuff.
So on the question of freedom,
yes.
which is one of the existentialist, it's part of our facticity, that we are determined by the world that we've been thrown into, and we're determined by our gender, society, social circumstances, but that we also, in our being thrown into situation, circumstance, we also invariably transcend, because human being is a transcendence. Another word for which is freedom. And this idea that is very insistent in Jean-Paul Sartre, that this freedom is a source of anguish for most people, because it comes with very heavy burdens of responsibility, and that most of us spend most of our time trying to evade that sense of responsibility and to conceal from ourselves this kind of groundless freedom that is human existence, no?
Yeah, perfectly said, Robert. And I think here, the language that Beauvoir uses, which I find powerful, her book that she writes before The Second Sex, the book that she considers her existentialist ethics, a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity. The word ambiguous or ambiguity is Beauvoir's formulation for capturing that we have these two sides to us, right? This facticity and this transcendence, and that they're kind of in tension, or that they don't make sense together. That if we talk about the world of facts, there are no freedoms in the world of facts, and that human beings are really this composition, this composite between these two pieces, and the danger is that we want to lapse back into facticity or immanence. And it's this great temptation that we have, not only with ourselves, but we love other people's help, right? We love being turned into an object, right? When we talk about objectification, there's some appeal from the subject's perspective of getting turned into an object, because it's so much, there's a solace in it. We don't have to make decisions. We're just, I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, I'm a belly dancer.
Yeah, or I'm an identity, cultural or otherwise.
You bet.
This is identity politics today.
Yes.
So go on.
Okay. Well, so and maybe we're diving a little bit into the second sex here, but I think one of the if we go back to the early 40s and we think about Beauvoir and Sartre, they're not only just literary and philosophical geniuses that have this grand vision of what they want to do in the world. They're also just good old-fashioned kind of cultural rebels, right? They're anti-status quo. They see the interwar period and then World War II and they think of the moral failures of the French in this period as kind of a result of this kind of bourgeois mentality. And I think a lot of the kind of vibrancy of their thought comes out of this rejection of the cultural values around them. And so this leads to a kind of problem for Beauvoir and for Sartre. I think the idea of social identities, these kind of ideas about who we might be, for Sartre, he gives the example of the waiter, that a waiter kind of plays like being a waiter. A waiter is a certain kind of personality, and a waiter, when you get a job in a French cafe, you try to become that waiter. That's a kind of a Platonic ideal of the waiter out there, and it's a social identity. And for Sartre and Beauvoir, those social identities are purely bad. They only constrict us. They're refuges for our bad faith. We cling to them so that we don't have to confront our freedom. And I think this is one of the things that we struggle with in our contemporary moment, is we see social identities sometimes as very constraining and even oppressive, but we also find great power in them. We think, well, let's say, so Sartre wrote a book about anti-Semitism, and for him the definition of a Jew is only an anti-Semitic definition. Right? There's no value or power in claiming yourself as a Jew, whereas we all know that not to be the case. There's a lot of cultural identities that, even when they're problematic and historical and ambiguous, we see real value in adopting them and claiming them for our own. We want to see some power in the idea of claiming a social identity that doesn't necessarily cut all of our freedom away. Yeah. And Beauvoir and Sartre are not good in the early formulations of their thought. They're not good about saying why we would want to do that. It just seems only bad to adopt social roles.
Yeah, I think I have to say that the analysis of the waiter, which is one of the most famous passages in Being and Nothingness.
Yeah.
I always found it very frustrating because I think it mistakes identity with a profession.
Yes.
I don't see why it has to be inauthentic to play a waiter as well as you can play the role of a waiter. And then when you're off work, you are who you are. Your identity is not submissive to your role as a waiter. I think it's a little bit unsatisfying unless you take the waiter as an example of how easily we can enter into roles and play roles. And
and I think you're right, Robert. I think there's a weakness there, but I think it's partly historical. I think Sartre's idea of the waiter in 1942 is somebody who, when they went home, they were still a waiter.
Right, exactly.
So it was kind of like the butler that we see, the remains of the day butler, right? That you never shirk that identity.
That's true, and I do agree with Simone de Beauvoir here, because the ethics of ambiguity, I think, is a brilliant analysis of different ways in which people get stuck in particular self-identifications, and thereby abnegating their transcendence, that we're always transcend a particular role or a particular profession. But she analyzes, she has a whole typology of the subman, the serious man, the adventurer.
Yep.
And it's when you actually solidify your identity with one of these roles that bad faith really takes hold of you.
Yeah, and how, what I love about that description in the Ethics of Ambiguity is how compelling it seems to adopt these rules, right? That they're very difficult to, it seems easy to say, no, I'm my own person. I reject those rules. But particularly as you get older and you commit to choices, voluntary choices in your life, those choices can calcinate, right? They can become hardened and
well, it's true. And it's where in Heidegger's Being and Time, one of the most interesting parts of that book for me is when he speaks about Wiederholung, or repetition, and where you have this resolve to be your finitude, and you're projected unto death, and you shatter against the possibility of your own death, and somehow that projection, that being unto death, will throw you back upon a series of possibilities that you have inherited or that the past transmits to you for free appropriation. And that freedom to choose your hero, as Heidegger puts it, is one where there would be nothing wrong with freely choosing to identify with your Jewish heritage, or to choose a hero and emulate, or become a Christian, or become whatever the choice may be. My feeling is that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir get in trouble by trying to propose norms which would distinguish between what is a good choice, authentic choice, and not a authentic choice.
Yeah, great. And you're right. I think Beauvoir and Sartre, particularly in this kind of moment, 43, 44, 45, right around the end of the war, they're really struggling with this. They have this clear idea, this philosophical commitment to the idea that freedom is freedom, right? And so if we choose to deny our freedom, bad faith is a choice, right? We can pretend we're not free, that we're a mother, we're a Christian, we're a whatever, and that defines everything about us. And what would make that choice any less authentic than to reject those things? So they have this philosophical position about freedom being an ontological condition of being human. There's no way you can get around it. It's not a choice. It's not a value. It's simply a fact of human life. And then on the other hand, they have this, I think, first cultural attitude that then becomes a political stance, which is that certain kinds of choices are better than others. And so to fight the Nazis is better than to be a Nazi or to be a collaborator, and to reject social norms is better than to embrace them. So why would that be more authentic? Is it just because everybody else is doing the bad one? Is that good enough? And here I think both of them struggle, and I think Beauvoir is the first to clearly identify what she calls this ethics of ambiguity, which is that so both Sartre and Beauvoir have this language of, I'm just going to back up a little bit and talk about the project, right? They both have this idea that we choose projects. And our projects, we might even think of as, in a kind of broad Aristotelian sense, are kind of means and ends, right? They're things we might do for the sake of other things. Here I am in the studio with you. Why am I doing that? Well, we're friends and we've talked about doing this, and why is that, right? So we could imagine a kind of series of nested choices, nested projects. that might go all the way out to the project of our very lives, right? And Sartre and Beauvoir believe that the largest level set of our projects is this kind of unspecified vision of what our life is, and we don't always have a sense of when we chose that or
how about bringing more thought into the world? How about dissemination of ideas? How about sharing?
So you know your project, Robert.
Well, so do you. You're an educator as much as I am. You spend even more time with students committed to this project now.
Good. Okay, good. So we've got projects. What makes projects better than other projects? Well, Beauvoir says that projects which lead to our ability to live out our freedom concretely, indefinitely, so meaning not a specified thing, but I can act out concretely in the lived world any old way I want, is better than projects that don't end up like that. So, for example, if I'm in solitary confinement, if I'm a political prisoner, I'm in solitary confinement, I can choose to characterize my life as a life of political struggle, of mute resistance. I could even commit suicide, maybe. I can't do just any old thing. I can't live out that freedom. I still have the freedom to define my life, define why it is that I'm in prison, decide the meaning of my life, but I can't decide to make myself a really nice breakfast with eggs Florentine. I can't do that. And it would be better if I could choose projects in my situation that led to more concrete freedoms that are indefinite, to be able to act in any other way. So those are the good kinds of projects that lead towards open horizons instead of closed horizons. And so Beauvoir just says just up front, hey, this is ethical. One is better than the other. And if we choose for ourselves to shut down our open horizons and choose close-ended projects, that's a moral failure. And if we cause others to do that, that's evil. So she's just straight up like there's an ethical system right there. The foundation of that system is freedom, and ethical choices fall out of seeing freedom not only as a human fact, but also as a grounding value in the world.
Yeah, no, it's true, and I still find that there's something sophistical in the argument that because freedom is an ontological condition, there is a norm for our concrete choices in life, which would be making choices that favor freedom rather than than the opposite. But
go ahead.
Yeah, she's very persuasive when she's analyzing the bad faith of these other types. The subman, the serious man, the bourgeois. This is where Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they were really quite brilliant because they love being in a tribunal where they themselves were not under accusation, where they were the accusers.
Robert, and I think the problem that you're talking about, I totally identify with. And it's this moment where there's this kind of social critique, which is very appealing, this kind of characterization of bad faith, both at the individual and the social level. And the kind of more philosophically rigorous backdrop to that they want to be just really hand in hand. And it seems like they're not totally hand in hand, right? It seems like, if we think about bad faith being just a cognitive part of human reality, like am I redefining my projects when I'm brushing my teeth? Or am I lapsing into immanence when I'm brushing my teeth? Well, I'm lapsing into immanence. No big deal, right? I mean, it's just part of cognition that we're not always going to be reinventing ourselves. That, for Sartre's, not a moral flaw. So when does it become a flaw? When does that kind of cognitive fact about us start to shape our behavior?
I think it's when you deliberately fail to not only take responsibility for the consequences of your action, but you fail to become aware of the degree to which you have brought about certain circumstances for yourself and for others without full awareness of how they had been chosen without your being aware of it. That's bad faith.
Yeah,
it's when you're lying to yourself where you're able to tell yourself that something that you know is not true and convince yourself of that.
Yep. And here, Robert, just because you said it so nicely just there, I'm just going to remind our listeners, when we talk about bad faith kind of casually, and I certainly do this all the time, we tend to talk about it in this sense of the human being composed of both freedom and facticity, right? Transcendence and immanence. And we tend to talk most of the time about bad faith being a willful lying to ourselves about the fact that we are transcendence, right? Yeah. We pretend that we are, in fact, this immanent fact about the world. But it's equally bad faith to forget that we are a thing, that we have immanence to us, right? And here's where we willfully forget our own past, right? We think, oh, we're pure transcendence. I can walk away from the child I had. I can walk away from that life because I'm free to choose. I don't have to take responsibility for that, right? So that's equally bad faith, is to forget that, in fact, our choices do become facts in the world, and we have to own those as equally as we own our freedom.
Sure. Jeremy, let's talk a little bit about The Second Sex, which is the major work that she's known for. And why do you think that book had such a powerful resonance when it came out? And why is it still a book that everyone should read today?
Good, great. My favorite question, Robert. I think for many decades, The Second Sex was seen rightly as having an impact, a real impact in the world, a political impact in the world of women's rights. It had an enormous impact in the English-speaking world. I think a bigger impact in the English-speaking world before really the French-speaking world. And really all the kind of forerunners in the Anglophone world of what we now call second-wave feminism were very influenced by this text. So the kind of 1950s, 1960s in England and America, reading the quickly translated English translation of The Second Sex had a huge impact on actually the lived experiences of women. So big political impact. And I think we're still living in the wake of that. I think, there both the excitement around Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In and also the criticisms of it just completely resemble the excitement and the criticisms of The Second Sex in 1949 and 1950.
I wouldn't put those two books in the same category.
Oh, I do.
Really in the same breath, yeah.
I do.
You do?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a wonder. Oh,
well, yeah.
Sandberg's book is doesn't have the philosophical heft of The Second Sex.
Well, we leave that aside.
Okay. But
you call it applied existentialism.
I do, and I think this is where I think its impact maybe among French intellectuals. I think some of them saw this. I think Sartre himself saw the importance of this book in terms of its philosophical impact. But I think we're still coming to terms with thinking about this book not as a foundational text in kind of European feminism, Western European feminism. We're still struggling with seeing it as really a book of philosophy. And I think that's really what's most exciting to me about the book. In addition to its supreme historical and political impact, I just think it's a book which is really trying to show us how to apply existentialism, and in particular in an area where it seems like existentialism might just not help us. I mean, I think when we first learn about existentialism, we see its immediate kind of thrill and also the burden of it in terms of our individual lives. We see it, I'm making choices, and those choices matter, and I'm the only person responsible for those choices. And so the immediate impact of existentialism is always at that kind of individualist level. And very early on in the 40s, everyone said, well, this is not going to help us with social problems. It's not going to help us think about broad collective issues. So for Beauvoir to pick up the subjugation, the second-class status of women all over the world and throughout time as a broad historical fact, a collective fact, and say, hey, existentialism's the right way to think about this, that was just an exciting kind of gauntlet thrown down to say that existentialism, first of all, can attack ethical problems, but really collective political problems, and it's the right way to do it. I just find that thrilling.
So what is her argument in The Second Sex about women and freedom?
Great. Well, first of all, she challenges us as existentialists to wonder why it could be that there is such a thing as sexism. So if we think about bad faith as being a choice we can make to, let's say I'm a young mother and I want to identify as a mother and that's my social role, that's bad faith on my part. So why would it be that a whole set of people, all women, would be somehow more collectively inclined to bad faith than men? That just seems bizarre. So it seems that we are aware of women making choices, and women have a social status in the world different than men. And it seems like individual choices about bad faith couldn't possibly make sense of that. So a priori, existentialism doesn't, bad faith at least, doesn't offer us a way to understand why it would be that women collectively have a second-class place in society. So Beauvoir, it has to then say, why would existentialism help us solve this problem? And here's her great insight, and I'll tell you, you just have to read the first 17 pages of the book. The whole book is wonderful, but the introduction spells it all out. She says that there's always two things going on. First of all, human beings find deep meaning and satisfaction in transcending. Transcendence, reaching beyond ourselves towards these projects, towards these open horizons. That's what human beings are made to do. That's when we're authentic. That feels good to us. All human beings constantly do it. That's what we're put on earth to do. That's what we do, whether we want to do it or not. But then we have these social roles, and some social roles celebrate transcendent activities in the world in terms of concrete, lived-out freedoms, and some don't. So for Sartre and Beauvoir, writing books is a kind of heroic activity of transcending yourself and putting yourself out there in the world and becoming someone new. And in fact, lots of roles that we might traditionally describe as masculine are socially seen as associated with lived freedom, concrete lived freedom. And then there are social roles that are kind of like making the bed and making breakfast for the family. And those are roles which have value, but do they lead towards open horizons? Do they open up towards new projects? Well, no, you got to kind of do them again tomorrow. They're always the same. So for Beauvoir, she characterizes a whole set of activities as kind of mired in immanence, right? You're never going to transcend. No matter how beautifully you make the bed, you're going to make the bed tomorrow. So what happens when a group of people get assigned roles which are mired in immanence? Well, if they want the social status and the social consolations that go along with those roles, then they need to agree to them. And that's kind of the bad faith choice, right? So I choose to be a mother, and maybe I'm giving up some transcendence, but I'm a great mother, and I get all the cultural value associated with that. So I get the cultural value, I get the social value, but I'm living in bad faith, so I'm not authentic. But if I'm a guy, and I get to be president, or a pirate, or the writer of great novels and plays and existentialist works of philosophy, well, then I'm authentically living out my freedom in a philosophically sensible way, and I'm also getting all the social status that goes along with being a male and having a traditional male situation. So for a group of people, even when I am mired in bad faith as a male, I might be still living out roles which might encourage me towards living authentically. Whereas for a woman, you got to choose. It's a double bind, right? Either you rebel and you are a social rebel. You cast off the social rules which define you, and then you get none of the solace or social status that goes with those things, but you live authentically. Or you have to live in bad faith, and then you get the social status. You can't have one or the other. I mean, you can only have one or the other. You don't get both. So for Beauvoir, this is the definition of oppression, when you can't live authentically with yourself, when a whole group of people can't be authentic. So to me, that's an exciting way to describe a social phenomenon that's still really grounded in the language of bad faith and authenticity and transcendence.
True. However, female facticity is not the same thing as male facticity.
No.
It's not universal the way Jean-Paul Sartre would have liked it to be when he speaks about human existence in a non-gendered way.
Yeah.
And female facticity requires a rather different approach than male facticity. And here I think that she has to come down against the traditional roles that women have played, historically speaking, so much so that she ends up indicting, am I putting it too strongly to say that she indicts motherhood as a choice?
Yeah, this is terrible. I mean, it's terrible for those of us that think that mothers are important and do important work in the world. Beauvoir seems very, very against.
Because you could say that what could be more transcendent than bringing new life into the world, nourishing that new life, because that is what the open horizon, it's the future and so forth.
Yep.
Men left to themselves, their horizons are much narrower insofar as natality is primarily of the other. Anyway,
right. Yeah. So you would think just off the cuff, right, that what could be more transcendent than motherhood, and also how great to be a woman in which built into your facticity is this ability of creating new life, right? That just seems like that's amazing, right? That's like the emblem of existentialism itself, is that built into our facticity is this power to create and invent. It's so symbolically perfect. Yet no.
And what are her reasons?
Well, so she goes into this in this brilliant and maybe infuriating chapter of The Second Sex about motherhood. Part of it is that, Beauvoir describes, and here we might accuse her of a little bit of bad faith as well, that her own life choices and her own kind of commitments as a person have led her to see motherhood in a really narrow sense, and for her not to understand that motherhood could be empowering or amazing or existentially profound. But here, her analysis goes something like this. There's really two ways that you might live out the experience of being a mother. The first is that you would see this new life as really being your project, as part of your open-ended project of the future, and it's all about you, right? It's your project. It's not about this other new life who is in fact their own subject. So this is kind of the steamrolling mother, right, who sees the new life as a way to relive, live out, repeat, or reinvent herself at the expense of the transcendence and authenticity of this child. So that seems obviously bad. Then what's the other alternative? Well, to really to live vicariously through this new life and to really see yourself as really only an auxiliary to this new life, that really the child, the son, the daughter is the true subject, and I'm the helper. As the mother, I'm the one who permits this transcendence to flourish.
That also has connections with her characterization of the serious man in The Ethics of Ambiguity, who says that it's the highway or the bridge, it's whatever I'm working on. That's the transcendent thing, and I am bringing that into. But that is what I worship, is the project, or it's the new life, it's the son.
Right.
I have to say, I believe that a lot of the primary narcissism that is socialized out of us when we're kids comes back, with a vengeance when some people become parents, where now in the name of their children, they permit themselves the most, atrocious forms of egotism and self-regard, where everything can be done, everything can be justified in the name of doing it for one's children.
Yeah. But Robert, here, this is where I disagree with Beauvoir. And I got to say, first of all, a lot of what I've been talking about, I've learned from colleagues of ours here at Stanford. So Lanier Anderson and Laura Whitman, your colleague in French and Italian, both their ideas about Beauvoir really influenced me. So I just want to shout out to them here. And Lanier Anderson and I have gone around on this, and he thinks Beauvoir is right about motherhood, or that her argument makes sense, and I want her and him to be wrong. So I'm clinging to that. And I kind of wish, in my optimism, I wish Beauvoir would have described these two dangers of motherhood as risks, right? The kind of steamrolling of the other and the kind of abasement of the self for the child as being two real dangers in motherhood. But in some ways, aren't they the real dangers in all of our encounters with the other? I mean, so this to me gets back to the old existentialist problem: is can we see of interactions with the other as anything other than a kind of a hostile competition where one has to be subject and one has to be object? Or is there such a thing as collaboration? Is it possible to live with another and have shared projects? Is that possible? So I see Beauvoir's challenge here on the motherhood front as similar to her larger challenge of trying to figure out what it would mean to share projects with others.
Yeah, good. So when it comes to this question of the concrete bases on which one makes decisions. And this problem that Jean-Paul Sartre and Beauvoir had, they invoke, both of them, Kant's categorical imperative, no?
Yep.
Which is, in Kant's articulation of it, it's that when I'm faced with a choice, I should ask myself, if this action that I'm going to commit were to be universalized across all of human society, what would be the consequences? Many of these choices would lead to the complete collapse and undoing of human society if everyone were to murder, if everyone were to steal, and so forth.
Yeah.
And although they don't want to apply it case by case, they do invoke this categorical imperative as the basis of human freedom and intersubjective relations, which seems highly problematic to me. So let me read a passage from the Ethics of Ambiguity.
Okay, great.
Where we go back now here to Hegel. And she says, each consciousness, she's quoting Hegel, each consciousness seeks the death of the other. And indeed, at every moment, others are stealing the whole world away from me, she says. The first movement is to hate them, but this hatred is naive, and the desire immediately struggles against itself. If I were really everything, there would be nothing beside me. The world would be empty. There would be nothing to possess, and I myself would be nothing. If he is reasonable, the young man immediately understands that by taking the world away from me, others also give it to me, since a thing is given to me only by the movement which snatches it away from me. To will that there be being is also to will that there be men by whom and for whom the world is endowed with human significations. Okay. Marjorie Green was one of the first American philosophers to engage with existentialism. And it's actually Lanier Anderson, with whom I did a show on Jean-Paul Sartre, who
I love that show.
Referred me to this essay of hers, Marjorie Green, written really contemporaneously almost with the Ethics of Ambiguity, called Authenticity and Existential Virtue. And let me just say what Marjorie Green, let me quote what she writes here. She says that there's some uneasiness is felt about this contradiction between, the Hegelian objectification war of subjects, that some uneasiness is felt about it even at headquarters being Simone. And it's evidenced by the extremely crude arguments with which Beauvoir has since attempted to dismiss it in Ethics of Ambiguity. The first view one takes of another, that of the other consciousness wants the death of mine, is naive, she says, for one at once realizes that, of course, as we all know, if anyone takes anything away from me, he is really giving it to me all the while. This is undoubtedly one of the worst philosophical arguments ever penned, not to mention the shocking fact that there are, in this case, 400 pages of naivete in the master's masterpiece. So, ouch. That does hurt, especially for as I said, I'm an avowed existentialist. I still hold to the basic arguments, but it's that kind of very French sophistical reasoning that what is given to me is actually taken away from me, and what's taken away from me is actually given to me, where everything becomes its opposite, that can become enervating and a source of frustration, not only for the analytic philosophers who are demanding more consistency, but even for people who are struggling to answer these questions like you were doing about why does motherhood have to be condemned in a blanket way? Can't there be cases in which the waiter can play his role to the best of his abilities while he's on duty, and then be someone else when he's not, and so forth?
Well, okay, Robert, I got a bunch of things to say to that. One, first of all, is I think part of our unease with this Kantian and Hegelian background in both Beauvoir and Sartre is that they both kind of rail against Kant and Hegel as being insufficient and not enough, and Sartre says he's not a Kantian, he's got all these problems with Kant, and he just sounds like a total Kantian. And this lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, which you and I have talked about before, is just wallowing in kind of pretty easy pop Kantian ethics. Which is nothing wrong with Kantian ethics, right? But if you're a Kantian, then just say you're a Kantian and be done with it. So part of it is their resistance to just say, hey, by the way, we agree with Kant on this one.
Right.
And I think Beauvoir is a little more honest here than Sartre. I think she's more willing to say, Kant's got something to offer us. So I think she's a little less dissimulating on this front about her debts to both Kant and to Hegel. So anything more to say than that? I mean, I kind of want to say back to Green that although I agree the kind of the speciousness of the anytime someone takes something for them, they're giving you something. I see that, and there are parts of that book that I think aren't beautifully written, or I guess not rigorously written. And in fact, Beauvoir herself didn't think much of this book, right? She kind of poo-poos it as being not as good as it should have been, and not her best writing, and
what the ethics of ambiguity. Yeah.
And I've always been sad about that because I see the book as really powerful.
Let me tell you what I suspect.
Okay, good.
Which is that the real power of Sartrean existentialism, Beauvoirian existentialism, in these was a tragic view of human relations, based on this idea that there's going to be this inevitable conflict of reification. Who can reify the other? And who is going to survive that encounter. And that this is existentialism when it's being truly honest with itself, and there's no subterfuge of bad faith, but that when Sartre and Beauvoir, immediate post-war, they're faced with a situation in France where Marxism was the hegemonic ideology of the time. And if you could not somehow conjugate your existentialism with Marxism, you were going to be cast out. You were going to be relegated to an insignificant margin of the intellectual times. And all these kind of specious attempts to make arguments whereby human solidarity has to become the foundation for decisions rather than human conflict, I think is an act of intellectual bad faith in order to make existentialism palatable to the Marxists. That's what what I suspect.
Well, I think you're right. Historically, you're without a doubt right, Robert. I think that both Beauvoir and Sartre felt the pressure, particularly from the Marxists. But I think we as existentialists should feel that same pressure, not from the Marxists, but just simply from the position of, shouldn't there be such a thing as ethics? Shouldn't we be able to say that some kinds of uses of freedom are better than others? I think if we don't know how to ground that in philosophical thinking, then that's a challenge for us.
But isn't it the case, Jeremy, that Sartre says there are no criteria or no norms for choosing one thing over the other? He gives these great examples in the essay in the lecture that Existentialism is Humanism. He speaks about the young man who chooses either to stay with his mother or go and join the resistance. And Sartre says, I can't tell you what to do. It's in the choosing that you will have affirmed your commitment.
Yep.
So if you're going to be truly existentially honest, you say that I cannot, as existentialism cannot provide ethical norms for choice.
Okay, good. Yeah. So let me try this on you, Robert. If then the choosing is what constitutes the human meaning, right? It's choice itself. Then what allows for choice? What is the precondition for choice? Well, it's this human fact about us that we are freedom, we are transcendence. So that is a precondition for all of the different kinds of choices we should make. And in some ways, that precondition is a moral ground. It permits choice. And so if there is some kind of aspect of our being which allows for that, basically ethical creation, creating our own ethics, then that precondition, that prerequisite, is itself an overriding moral ground, freedom itself. So freedom is not only a fact about ourselves, but it is a normative force. We should choose choice-making. It is better to choose in the name of freedom because freedom itself governs and allows choice to occur.
But you said it yourself earlier, I am free to choose to become a mother. And if I choose it in full cognizance of this unconditional freedom and responsibility that I'm thrown into, then it's just as authentic a decision as the person who decides that motherhood is not for her.
Great. Yeah, and here I think this is, again, you're calling this intellectual bad faith on Beauvoir and Sartre's part. And I have to agree with you, particularly with the word of authenticity. So they want authenticity to be kind of a badge of courage, as a moral virtue in some ways.
Yeah, they want it to be on the right side of history.
Yep. And I think authenticity can go along with all kinds of choices that we might call, even from an existentialist perspective, unethical.
I think especially from an existentialist perspective, all sorts of very dubious choices can be perfectly authentic.
Yes.
This is what is scary about existentialism. This is what can be the cause for a wholesale repudiation of it, precisely the fact that if it's internally consistent with its own premises, it cannot presume to be a normative ethical philosophy.
Or it has to find that normative grounding in existence itself.
Yes.
Right? So it can't look elsewhere.
Right.
So that's the crucial part, is that it can't look elsewhere for normative grounding. And this is the problem with all the existentialists, right? We have this problem in Heidegger. We have it with Nietzsche, right? All these people, we worry like, now, how are we all going to decide when to cross the street together?
Yeah.
Right? So this is a built-in problem with existentialism. Again, I think Beauvoir offers us the most clarity about how to meet this problem. And here I think she is the closest to saying you can be authentic and evil. So you can make choices which are in full cognizance of your freedom, but steamroll the freedoms of others. And there is an existentialist claim to call that evil.
Well, let's say that existentialism and evil can coexist. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the authenticity of the behavior of the two protagonists in question, no?
Yes.
Because you know better than I do that they had relations with others, and especially, younger women, where Beauvoir was seducing her students, sometimes, the 16-year-old, 17-year-old, getting these young women into a network, passing them on to Jean-Paul Sartre, and we don't have to rehearse all the sordid details, but these are facts that have come out with documentation that's even much more revealing since the death of Simone de Beauvoir.
Oh, yes.
But actually, you say, well, were they either being in bad faith when they were espousing all this moral righteousness of existential authenticity as a criterion, or were they being existentially authentic and yet opting for things that you and I might consider, if not evil, then ethically very dubious?
Yep. Great, Robert. I mean, this is a tough subject for me, because I admire these two.
I do too. No doubt.
And you and I were talking about this the other day, and I was saying, well, you look at any figure in history, and the more you learn about them, the worse they look. And so, what, you choose not to look closely, or do you accept that human beings are imperfect, morally imperfect? And you stopped me short, and I just want to call that out, that for some reason it seems worse with these two, that their moral failings, or their failings as individuals, their personal life, the choices they made, seem somehow more, their hypocrisies seem more urgent and more important for us to dwell on than with other people. That's somehow worse.
Well, yeah, because we can assume that there's exploitation there in full. Now, in my more favorable moments, I say that the authenticity of Sartre and Beauvoir on this issue was to go out there and publicly campaign for the abolition of the age of consent. Okay, great.
Yeah.
If you will go out there and say that the age of consent when it comes to sex doesn't make sense, that it's denying the agency of even young teenage girls and boys, then you could say that the seductions of her students, age 16 or 17, and the ménage à trois with Jean-Paul Sartre, that I am treating them, I'm speaking in her voice now, I am treating these young people as full-fledged human agents capable of choice. And for society to condescend and say that you don't have the existential maturity to make decisions for yourself until you reach age 18 is a form of institutionalized bad faith in the society as a whole. That I can agree with, because if you were raised a Catholic like I was, there was the age of reason was 7. No.
Yep.
Up until age 7, you were not liable for damnation, eternal damnation, because you were only after age 7 could you commit a mortal sin because you knew the difference between right and wrong.
Yep.
So that's, if you want an age of consent, let's make it 7. Anyway, in other words.
Okay. Yep. Go. And so you can go to hell when you're 8, but you're not allowed to have sex.
That's right.
Yeah, that seems wrong.
That's part of their argument. No?
Yep. And so, so the moment you're referring to, Robert, is this petition that Beauvoir and Sartre signed in 1977 against the age of consent, that Michel Foucault was associated with, and a younger generation, in fact, that was thinking about social power and state control, particularly as a way of persecuting non-normative sexualities. And I think this is a moment where Beauvoir and Sartre were, and actually all the philosophers that got behind this petition were, if not on the wrong side of history, certainly blindsided. I mean, I think Foucault in particular is this theorist of power. And to ignore the kind of power dynamics that occur between a young person and an older person, right? All that kind of stuff, it all is kind of careful examinations of not just institutionalized power, but social power, individual power relations, to see that the age of consent or that sexual relations between a young person and an old person is somehow only permeated by institutional power relations instead of interpersonal power relations, I think is just extremely short-sighted. So I think they made that mistake along with Michel Foucault and many others. I do think that their own choices, and here not in 1977, but in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s, their own personal choices to kind of ensnare people who were bowled over by their intellectual brilliance and their cosmopolitan lifestyle, and to use them and abuse them and then discard them, I think has nothing to do with this later formulation of age of consent. There, I think the 1977 age of consent is an attempt to become consistent philosophically with lived principles. And I think if you go back to this earlier time in their lives when they were most guilty of this kind of ensnarement, there was nothing like that going on at all. It's completely, has nothing to do with seeing the other as a subject with their own legitimacy and authenticity. It's just purely using them as an object.
No, I agree.
I just think there's no way around that. I think,
So to wrap it all up,
yes,
we began by saying that the thought of Beauvoir is still profoundly relevant to today.
Yes.
Not because we live in a world which is existentialist. If anything, our times are rather steeped in bad faith from all sides and at all ages. And at least I'm speaking for myself now, I'm not speaking for you, but I think that what we need the most is a heavy dose of existentialist realism about our own strong agency when it comes to the things that happen to me, the choices that I make, and the subterfuge of thinking that somehow I'm not on the bad side of things, that I'm always on the good side of things.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so for me, I do agree with you, Robert. I think that, and this is to me why Beauvoir is so compelling, is that Beauvoir, she's an existentialist. So at the core, she believes in human freedom, individual choices, that we are responsible for how we respond to the situation we're in. And I don't think she ever lets go of that. And yet, particularly in the second sex, she is able to use that analysis of human freedom to show us a world which seems like allows certain groups lived out freedoms that are different than others. So it gives us a way to analyze social forces, social pressures, to identify victims without taking away their agency and their choice. So this is our problem, right? In our contemporary world, we're constantly wanting to honor and empower individuals for their autonomy and freedom. But we also want to recognize that they're the victim of social pressures, and it's a zero-sum game, right? The more agency we give them, the more we turn them into responsible for their fate, and the more we acknowledge that they have been the recipients of crimes, that they're victims, the more we turn them into an object. So there's no way to win. And Beauvoir's project in The Second Sex is to say that we have to have it both ways, that we can be at once victims, legitimately, objectively described, that there's such a thing as oppression out there. And yet that doesn't denude us. That's not the whole story. That's not the whole story. Right. We still have freedoms, and in fact, we'll never understand that oppression unless we understand that oppression is caused by human freedom.
And is also transcendable.
Yep. So to me, her language of bringing those together, not one at the expense of the other, but to see those as both vital components at social description, to just understand the world we live in, I find very, very exciting.
Well said. We've been speaking with Jeremy Sable here on Entitled Opinions. Thanks for joining us, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me.
It was a long wait, but well worth it. And to all you listeners out there for Entitled Opinions, we'll be looking forward to having you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.